The library smelled like dust and old paper, and something faintly sweet that I'd never been able to identify in 3 years of working there. Maybe the binding glue on the older volumes, maybe just the particular way that time smelled when it was preserved in pages. I stood at the returns cart, sliding books back into their places on the shelf, with the muscle memory of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, which I had. Exactly 1,000 times, probably more. The Millhaven Public Library wasn't large enough to require much variety in the daily routine. There were only so many shelves, only so many regulars, only so many hours between 9 in the morning and 6 in the evening when the front doors closed, and I walked the 8 blocks back to my apartment in the kind of silence that starts to feel like company when you live alone, long enough. 24 years old, and I'd already learned to be grateful for small constants. The weight of a book in my hands, the specific creak of the 3rd floorboard near the periodicals section, the way Mr. Okonkwo always returned his large print westerns on Tuesdays, always slightly overdue, always with the same sheepish smile. Sloane. My coworker Bet appeared around the end of the biography shelves, her reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, her expression carrying that particular quality she reserved for bad news. Carla wants us in the back room, all of us. The all of us was telling. There were only 4 staff members at Millhaven Public. When Carla gathered all of us, it was never about something good. I knew before I even sat down. The city had been cutting budget lines for 18 months. The branch on Fenwick Street had closed in February. We'd all been watching the numbers, all doing the arithmetic in our heads and getting the same answer. The one none of us wanted to say out loud. Carla didn't make us wait. She was kind that way, choosing speed over ceremony. The library would close at the end of the fiscal quarter. 11 weeks. There were severance packages. Modest ones, she emphasized, her voice careful around the word modest. And references for all of us. She was sorry. She'd fought for us as long as she could. I walked home that evening without really seeing the sidewalk. 11 weeks. I did the math I'd been avoiding. My savings account held just over $4,000, which sounded like something until you subtracted rent, utilities, the student loan payment that came out automatically on the 15th of every month for a degree I'd never finished. My mother had gotten sick during my junior year, and I'd come home to help, and then she'd gotten better, and somehow I'd never gone back. That was 3 years ago. The library job had been supposed to be temporary, a placeholder while I figured out the next thing. I was still figuring. The next morning, Carla forwarded us an email from the city's Cultural Affairs office. Millhaven Public Library and its building had been purchased by a private developer as part of a broader revitalization project for the Fenwick corridor. The developer, a company called Ashford Group, intended to repurpose the building into something called a community anchor space, which was phrasing so vague it could mean anything from a genuine public resource to a co-working loft with exposed brick and $12 cold brew. The email said a representative from Ashford Group would be visiting the library Friday to assess the space and meet with staff. I spent Thursday night researching Ashford Group on my laptop in bed, the blue light of the screen making my eyes ache. The company was based in Chicago. It had developed properties in 8 cities over the past decade. Everything from residential towers to mixed-use commercial spaces. The founder and CEO was a man named Reed Ashford, 38 years old, who apparently gave enough to UTS and literacy nonprofits that a few journalists had called him a contradiction in terms. A developer with a conscience, though the phrase always appeared in quotation marks, as if the writers weren't fully convinced. There were photos of him at galas and groundbreakings. Always composed, always slightly apart from whoever stood next to him. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved with deliberate economy. Nothing soft about it. Dark eyes that even in photographs seemed to be calculating something the camera couldn't capture. I closed the laptop and told myself it didn't matter what he looked like. What mattered was whether Ashford Group was going to gut the library and replace it with something that served no one who actually lived in Millhaven. Friday came cold and gray, a March morning that hadn't committed to spring yet. Carla had us tidy the reading room and set out the good chairs around the large reference table, the ones we normally reserved for the after-school tutoring sessions. I restocked the new arrivals display near the entrance, straightening spines with more care than was strictly necessary, because I needed something to do with my hands. The car that pulled up at 10:15 was black and quiet and expensive looking, and the man who stepped out of it moved with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from arrogance, so much from a lifetime of never being in a room where anyone outranked you. I was reaching up to adjust a book on the top shelf when he walked in. I didn't turn around immediately. We'd just opened, and I assumed it was a regular patron. Then Carla's voice took on that particular careful brightness that people use when they're trying to seem unintimidated, and I turned. Reed Ashford was taller in person than the photographs suggested, broad through the shoulders in a charcoal coat that had clearly been made for him specifically. He was taking in the reading room with those assessing eyes, moving across the space slowly, and something about the quality of his attention was different from most people's. Most people look at a room and see a room. He looked at it like he was reading it, like the shelves and the arrangement of chairs, and the water stain on the ceiling tile near the window were all a text he was translating in real time. Then his gaze landed on me, and I realized I was still holding the book I'd been shelving, arms still half raised, frozen in what was probably a fairly undignified posture. I brought my arm down and turned back to the shelf like I hadn't been caught staring, which was the wrong move because it made it worse. And for reasons I still can't fully explain, I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. Carla introduced us. I was the last one she got to, and I'd arranged my expression into something I hoped read as professional by the time she said my name. Sloan Mercer, I said, extending my hand. I do reference services and programming. He shook it. His hand was warm, his grip brief and firm, and he looked at me for a moment the way he'd looked at the room, like he was reading something. Reed Ashford. And then, because apparently he felt the need to add something, "You're not what I expected." I had no idea what to do with that, so I said nothing. Carla guided him toward the reference table, and I returned to what I'd been doing, which increasingly felt like rearranging deck chairs. I could hear the conversation in pieces. Carla's careful optimism, Reed Ashford's questions that were fewer and more precise than I expected from someone in his position. He wasn't performing interest. He was actually interested, or doing a very good impression of it. At some point, one of the regulars came in needing help navigating the state's online benefits portal, which was designed by someone who had clearly never needed to use it themselves. And I spent 40 minutes at one of the public computers walking her through it. When I looked up, Reed Ashford was standing a few feet away, watching, not in a strange way, more the way you watch someone who's doing something well, a kind of quiet evaluation. "She comes in twice a week," I'd said, because the silence felt like it needed something in it. "She doesn't have internet at home. We're the only place in the neighborhood with free public access terminals that are reliably working." "How many people use the library for non-book services?" he asked. "Just that. Not what do you mean, or that's interesting." A direct question, like he was collecting data. "About 40% of our traffic on any given day," I said. "Computer access, printing, fax machine. Yes, we still have a fax machine, because some government agencies require faxed documents and low-income residents can't easily access one otherwise. Notary services, tax form assistance in February and March. ESL conversation practice on Thursday afternoons." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not in the city's profile of the property." "No," I agreed. "It usually isn't." He looked at me again with that reading quality, and I held his gaze this time instead of looking away. Whatever he was looking for, I didn't know, but I wasn't going to be the first one to flinch. "I'd like to speak with you more before I leave," he said, "if you have time." "I work here," I said. "I have time." That almost got a smile, not quite, but almost. The corner of his mouth moved, the way the edge of a door moves when someone on the other side shifts their weight, a suggestion of something without the thing itself. Then he turned back toward Carla, and I went back to work. We talked for 20 minutes before he left. He asked about the ESL program, the tax assistance, the volume of computer use, the after-school hours. He asked what I would keep if I were designing the space from the beginning. I told him honestly, and I tried to keep the edge out of my voice. The edge that said you're still going to do whatever you were already going to do, and this conversation is theater, because I didn't know yet if that was true. When the black car pulled away from the curb, Carla stood beside me at the window. "That went better than I thought," she said carefully. "I wasn't sure, but it hadn't gone badly. That felt like something. He emailed 3 days later. His assistant sent it, a woman named Helen, whose messages were models of professional economy. But at the bottom was a note in a different register, more direct, that I suspected Reed had written himself. We're reconsidering the program mix for the Fenwick space. Your breakdown of non-book services was useful. Would you be available for a call Tuesday at 2? I said yes. The call ran an hour and a half. He asked good questions, and he actually listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. By the end of it, he'd asked if I would be willing to consult on the community programming component of the project. I said yes to that too, before I'd thought it through. Before I'd considered what it meant to help someone redesign the place I was losing. Before I'd asked what the consulting arrangement would pay, which turned out to be more than my current salary by a margin that made me recalculate my situation in real time while I was still on the phone with him. I need to be transparent about something, I said. Go ahead. I think what's happening to this library is wrong. I think the city shouldn't have sold it. I think the people who depend on it deserve better than a developer's interpretation of what a community needs. I paused. I also think if someone is going to redesign this space, it should be someone who actually knows what this community needs, and I'm one of the only people with that information. So I'll help, but not because I think this is how it should have gone. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to wonder if I'd just talked myself out of a job offer. That's fair, Reed said finally. His voice was even, but something in it had shifted slightly, a fraction of warmth I hadn't heard before. I'd rather work with someone honest about their reservations than someone performing enthusiasm they don't feel. I started the following Monday. The next 6 weeks were an education in a world I'd known existed, but had never inhabited. Reed ran his company out of a Chicago office, but had set up a project headquarters in Millhaven, a rented suite in the office building 2 blocks from the library, all glass and new carpet and the particular smell of corporate ambition. I came in 3 days a week and worked alongside his project team, who were smart and professional, and looked at me with a kind of polite confusion, the way you'd look at a cat that walked into a board meeting. Reed was in Millhaven about half the time, in Chicago the rest. When he was there, the energy in the office changed in a way that wasn't about fear so much as focus. Everyone became a slightly sharper version of themselves, including me, which I noticed with some annoyance. He had a habit of appearing beside me, without announcing himself, which should have been unnerving, but somehow wasn't. He'd look at whatever I was working on and ask a question. That usually went straight to the thing I was uncertain about, and I'd answer it, and sometimes he'd push back, and sometimes he'd just nod once in that economical way that meant he'd registered it and filed it. One afternoon I was arguing, politely but persistently, for maintaining the free computer terminals in the new design. The project manager, a very organized man named Stewart, who had an allergy to anything that cut into leasable square footage, kept steering the conversation toward a reduced terminal count. The terminals are at capacity every day we're open, I said. We turn people away. Reducing them is moving in the wrong direction. The space cost analysis doesn't support. The space cost analysis doesn't include the cost of those 40 people going somewhere else, I said. Which is nowhere, because there isn't anywhere else. That cost doesn't show up in your spreadsheet, but it's real. Stewart opened his mouth. I heard Reed's voice from the doorway where he'd apparently been standing for an indeterminate amount of time. Keep the terminals, he said. Full count. And then he walked away. Stewart looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between irritated and reluctant respect. I looked down at my notes and kept my face neutral. After that, people in the office stopped treating me like a guest and started treating me like something closer to a colleague. I wasn't sure if Reed had said something or if it had just shifted on its own, but I noticed it. I also noticed him noticing me, which I tried not to think about too carefully. He had a way of being present in a room that was different from most people. Not louder or more physically dominant, just more there somehow. And sometimes when I looked up from my work, I'd find him already looking at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Something that wasn't quite a professional evaluation, but wasn't the thing I was trying not to let myself name either. The turning point came at a community meeting we'd organized at the city rec center. 43 people showed up, which was 43 more than Stuart had projected. I'd spent 2 weeks reaching out to the neighborhood, door-knocking with flyers, talking to the ESL students, asking Mr. Okonkwo to spread the word among the Tuesday Western crowd. Reed arrived late, slipping into the back of the room as I was facilitating, and I saw the moment he took in the full chairs and the raised hands, and something that might have been surprise crossing his face before he composed it back to neutral. Mrs. Okonkwo, who I hadn't known, was married to my favorite patron, stood up and said that her neighbor's grandson had learned to read at this library. And she wanted to know if the new space would have a children's section. A man named Dwight, who was between jobs, said he'd interviewed for 3 positions that required computer skills he'd learned for free at our terminals. A teenager named Semina said the Thursday ESL group was the only place her grandmother felt comfortable going alone. I translated nothing. I just let it land. Afterward, Reed found me in the parking lot as I was loading folding chairs into my car. "Let me help." He took the chairs without waiting for me to say yes, which under other circumstances might have annoyed me. Under these circumstances, I was tired enough to just move over and let him. "You mobilized all of them," he said. "I asked them," I said. "There's a difference. They mobilized themselves. They were already there. Nobody had just asked before." He was quiet, setting the last chairs in my trunk. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the overhead lights making everything look both too bright and somehow dim. "I've done a lot of projects, Sloan. I've sat through a lot of community meetings." He said it without self-congratulation, just as a statement of fact. "I've never seen one like that, because you usually buy the building before you talk to the people in it," I said, and immediately thought maybe that was too far. But he didn't deflect or justify. "Yes," he said, "usually." We stood there in the parking lot for a moment, not quite looking at each other, not quite looking away. "Thank you," he said finally, "for doing this even though you didn't want to." "I wanted to," I said, and realized it was true. I just didn't want it to be necessary. He drove home and I drove home, and I sat in my apartment for a long time afterward, not watching television, just thinking about the way he'd said my name in that parking lot. Not like a consultant's name, not like a colleague's name. A week later he asked me to dinner, framed as a working dinner, ostensibly to discuss the children's programming component. And I went because it was easier to pretend it was professional than to have the conversation where I admitted it wasn't. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menu had no prices, and the lighting was designed to make everyone look like they were having the best night of their lives. I wore the nicest thing I owned, a dark green dress I'd bought for my cousin's wedding 2 years ago, and sat across from Reed Ashford and ate food that I'd never have dreamed of ordering if I'd been paying for it, and talked about library programming for maybe 30 minutes out of 2.5 hours. The rest of the time we talked about other things. He'd grown up in Cincinnati, the kind of neighborhood he now developed. Economically struggling, underserved, the sort of place where the library, if there was one, was the only reliable heated public space in winter. He'd built his company by understanding those places from the inside, which was the version of him the press called contradictory, and which made considerably more sense to me now than it had before. I told him about my mother's illness, about the degree I'd deferred and then never returned to, about the way the library had started as a placeholder and slowly become something I couldn't imagine being without. He listened the way he listened when I talked about community data. Like every word mattered, and he wasn't waiting for his turn to speak. When his driver pulled up in front of my building at the end of the night, he got out of the car and walked me to the door, which was not something I'd expected, and we stood on the front steps in the March air that had finally, tentatively, started to smell like spring. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm aware of the dynamic here. I own the building you work in. I'm signing your consulting checks. I'm not going to pretend that's uncomplicated." "It's not," I agreed, "but I also find myself considerably less able to be objective about you than I'd like." I looked at him. The lamplight caught the angles of his face and made him look, for once, less like someone calculating and more like someone waiting. "You spent 6 weeks asking me questions," I said. "You never ask that one. I'm asking now." I kissed him first, which surprised us both. He recovered quickly and kissed me back, and the spring air was cold, and the lamplight was warm, and somewhere a car alarm went off 2 streets over, and none of it mattered. We were careful after that. He adjusted my consulting arrangement, so it ran through a formal contract with a third-party HR firm, which was either very professional or very over-engineered, and I suspected it was both. His project team figured it out within a week anyway. It turned out not to matter how careful you are, when everyone in a small office watches where your eyes go. Maggie, who ran the project's community liaison work and had been friendly toward me from the beginning, cornered me in the break room one morning, with a look I recognized from every female friendship I'd ever had, the look that was equal parts concern and wanting the details. "He's not like this usually," she said, refilling her coffee with studied casualness. "With people he works with. I've been with Ashford Group 4 years and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "I don't know what you mean," I said, which was the least convincing thing I'd ever said. Maggie said. She walked out with her coffee. "The project was beautiful. I didn't want it to be. I'd wanted it to be mediocre so I could maintain my grievance cleanly, but it was beautiful. The design kept the bones of the original building, the high ceilings and the original woodwork, and the long windows that let the afternoon light pour in. The children's section was bigger than we'd had before. The computer terminal stayed at full count, and we'd added 6 more, with a dedicated privacy screen station for job applications and benefits portals. The ESL program got its own room, with a whiteboard and real chairs instead of folding ones. We kept the old card catalog cabinet near the entrance, stripped and refinished, repurposed as a display case for photographs of the library over its 90-year history. It had been my idea, and Reed had said yes before I'd finished explaining it. We named it after much deliberation, the Millhaven Community Library and Resource Center, which was a mouthful but true. No one on Reed's team had suggested honoring the name. I had. Reed had agreed immediately and moved on, as if it was obvious. The night before the reopening, Reed and I were the last people in the building. He'd sent the team home at 9 and stayed to walk through the space with me, which I suspected was less about final inspections and more about giving me time in the building alone with what we'd built. I stood in the middle of the reading room in the dark, the streetlight coming through those long windows, and tried to hold both things at once. The grief of what had been lost and the genuine goodness of what had replaced it. They were both true. That was something I'd had to learn. Reed stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, watching me. "You're deciding whether to forgive me," he said. "I forgave you weeks ago," I said. "I'm deciding whether to tell you that." He smiled. Actually smiled. The real version. The one I'd been cataloging in my memory the way I used to catalog new acquisitions, carefully, with attention to exactly what made it worth keeping. It changed his whole face. It made him look like someone who had once, a long time ago, been a kid who loved something without knowing he was supposed to pretend he didn't. "Sloane," he said, and something in the way he said it, unhurried, like a statement of fact, made my chest ache in a way I'd stopped trying to explain to myself. "I know," I said. He crossed the room and I didn't move away from him, and when he pulled me in I let myself rest against him in the dark, in the library that was and wasn't the same library, in the life that was and wasn't the same life. The reopening the next morning brought more people than we had chairs for. Mr. Okonkwo arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes before the doors opened, and claimed the corner table he'd been coming to for 11 years. Mrs. Okonkwo came at 9:15 with a pan of jollof rice that she insisted be put out for the reception table, and which disappeared in 40 minutes. Zemina brought her grandmother, who held my hand for a long moment, and said something in Spanish that Zemina translated as "thank you for not forgetting us," which made it very difficult for me to maintain any kind of professional composure. Reed stood against the wall near the new periodicals section, watching all of it with those dark eyes that were finally, unmistakably warm. He caught me looking and raised the coffee cup. I'd brought him an hour earlier in a small, private toast. I'd come to this job grieving a place and everything it represented. I'd stayed for reasons that started practical and became something I didn't have good words for yet. The library was still here. It was different, and it was the same, and it was mine, in a way that had nothing to do with ownership, and everything to do with the 3 years I'd spent learning every creak and corner of it, and Reed Ashford, who I'd expected to be a villain, and found instead to be a man carrying his own complicated history with what places mean and what it costs to build something lasting. He was here too, looking at me like the room looked, like there was something worth reading, something worth the patience it took to understand it. Some things you lose and they're just gone. Some things you lose and what comes next, if you're willing to stay in it, turns out to be something you couldn't have found any other way. I set my own coffee down on the returns desk, where I'd stood 1,000 times, and walked over to where he was standing, and I let the morning happen around us. The noise and the laughter, and the smell of old paper mixing with fresh paint, and I didn't try to hold it still or make it mean only one thing. It meant all of them. I was learning to be okay with that.